Hello and welcome to more history stuff. Yes, yet more. So in my last episode dealing with the Wars of the Roses, I described the blunder at Barnet, the Battle of Barnet on the 14th of April 1471, in which the Lancastrians were defeated and John de Vere, the 13th Earl of Oxford, who is the main subject of these videos, was forced to flee, while his allies, Richard Earl of Warwick, the so-called Kingmaker, were killed, along with several others, such as Richard's brother, the Marquess of Montague, and several other Lancastrian commanders. So Barnet was a huge defeat for the Lancastrians and a big victory for Edward IV and the Yorkists, but all was not lost for the House of Lancaster, because there was still the Queen, Margaret of Anjou, who was still in France, with her son, Prince Edward of Westminster, the son and heir of Henry VI. Now, while Henry himself was now once again in Yorkist custody, he was really little more than the figurehead by this point, and the effective leadership of the House of Lancaster had passed to his Queen Margaret, and all their hopes for the future were invested in her son Edward. I mean, it's a little confusing that the two main protagonists on both sides were called Edward, but we can't do anything about that. So after the slaughter at Barnet, Oxford is, as I said, forced to flee with what's left of his men, and he doesn't actually take part in the battle that follows, which is the Battle of Tewkesbury, fought in Gloucestershire, because he is fleeing north. He's being hotly pursued by the Yorkists, and he's forced to take refuge all the way up in Scotland, which means that he can't link up with Margaret and Prince Edward when they finally land in England. They cross over, and I believe they land in Weymouth in Dorset on exactly the same day as the Battle of Barnet was fought. So that was pretty bad timing by the Lancastrians, because if they'd all managed to link up and then turn around with a big combined army to confront Edward IV, they might have done better. As it was, one Lancastrian army had been defeated at Barnet, and now the other, under Margaret and Prince Edward and her nobles, who chiefly were John Courtenay, the Earl of Devon, and the Duke of Somerset, the 4th Duke of Somerset, they now had to try and recover the advantage and reverse the defeat at Barnet. So their first move is to try and head to Wales to try and join up with the Lancastrians in Wales, because Wales is a really sort of Lancastrian loyalist stronghold. The Welsh Lancastrians there are led by Jasper Tudor, who is a half-brother of Henry VI, and uncle to Henry Tudor, who will one day become Henry VII, the first king of the Tudor dynasty. But that's all a long way in the future, and at this moment in time things are looking rather desperate for the Lancastrian cause. Edward IV moves very quickly to intercept Margaret and her army and prevent her from joining up with Jasper and the Welsh Lancastrians. And the two armies finally, after much manoeuvring, confront each other at Tewkesbury, which is in North Gloucestershire near the Welsh border. So the Lancastrians have been chased all the way here by Edward. They're too exhausted to go much further, because most of Margaret's men are foot soldiers, whilst most of Edward's men were on horseback. And while they almost reach Wales, they can't go another step without being completely exhausted and demoralised. So Margaret and her commanders have got little choice but to turn around and risk a battle. They take up a pretty good defensive position, I believe near or on an old hill fort near Little Salisbury, which means that Edward has got to fight uphill, Edward IV that is. And the Lancastrian position is also defended by lots of broken ground, hedgerows, and evil lanes, as the contemporary chroniclers put it, these very tricky, narrow little lanes that the Yorkists are going to have to fight over to get at the enemy. So the battle begins, and Edward has to advance and somehow prise the Lancastrians out of this defensible position. And quite cleverly, Edward places 200 men in a nearby wood near one flank of the Lancastrian army to prevent the Lancastrians working their way around and launching any surprise attacks. And the Earl of Devon, one of Margaret's commanders, doesn't see this movement. He is unaware that Edward has placed his reserve in the wood. And what he thinks he can do, he thinks he spies an opportunity to rush down from the hillside where his men are positioned and wrap around the flank of Edward's advancing army and sort of roll up their battle line. So he attacks, and at first it seems to be going pretty well for the Lancastrians. They push back the Yorkists, but then Edward's men stage a counterattack, and at the same time the Yorkists who are hidden in the wood, they suddenly appear without warning and hit the Lancastrians in the flank, which is what Devon had been hoping to do to the Yorkists. So his men are smashed all to pieces in the close quarter fighting that follows. Devon himself manages to get out of the mess, and he charges back up the hill and he confronts Lord Wenlock, who was one of the Lancastrian commanders. He's in command of the Lancastrian centre. And what follows is one of the sort of great tragi-comic dramatic moments of the Wars of the Roses. Devon demands to know why Lord Wenlock failed to support him when his men were in trouble. Why did he just sit on the hill, not come up and support? And before Wenlock can answer, Devon just picks up an axe and smashes his brains out. He kills him on the spot, which may have been satisfying for Devon, but it pretty much destroys any hope the Lancastrians have got of rallying, because their commanders are now killing each other. And that's pretty much the end of it, really, or any hope of a Lancastrian victory, despite the fact that they hold the high ground. They've made a complete mess of their defensible position, and soon afterwards the army breaks apart. Panic spreads, as it usually does in these battles, the sort of late medieval era, and they flee in all directions. And Edward is in no mood to have any mercy. He's had to fight one battle after another in the last 10 years to secure his position as king. And he's perfectly prepared to be ruthless. And up until this point, he probably hasn't been ruthless enough. And now he's not messing about at all. He is determined to wipe out the Lancastrians once and for all. And that means killing as many of their leaders as possible by any means, and the sort of usual chivalrous laws of warfare are thrown out the window at Tewkesbury. He orders his men to give chase, and when some of the Lancastrian knights try to take refuge in the nearby church, Edward ignores the usual rules of sanctuary, and he just has them dragged out and executed. And there's a whole round of executions that last for several days. Any of the Lancastrian commanders who survived the battle and who are captured afterwards, they're just beheaded after the merest, sort of show trial or no trial. They're just killed, beheaded in the marketplace at Tewkesbury. And one of the casualties, most significantly, is Prince Edward, Margaret's son and heir. He's only 17. He was in the Lancastrian centre, but probably not really in command because he was too young and had no military experience. He was just sort of there to give the Lancastrians like a rallying point. This is who they're fighting for. There are various accounts of how he died. Some of them say that he was killed during the fighting. Others that he was caught by the men of the Duke of Clarence, who up until fairly recently had been fighting for the Lancastrians until he switched sides. And Clarence did this because he had only supported the Lancastrians in the hope that he would become king in place of his brother Edward IV. But then he realised that that wasn't going to happen because Prince Edward was the preferable heir. I mean, he was the son of Henry VI, so that gave Clarence no reason to continue fighting for Lancaster, and he just went back to Edward IV. And several chronicle accounts say that it was his men who captured Prince Edward on the battlefield, and Clarence ordered the boy to be killed on the spot, possibly beheaded on a block. But however it happened, the fact was that Prince Edward was dead, and that did more than anything to rip the heart out of the Lancastrian cause. The wars are effectively over at this point, or at least for the foreseeable future. The only sort of Lancastrian heir left is Henry Tudor, who I mentioned a few minutes ago, and he's really a rank outsider. And very few people in 1471 would have predicted that he would one day become king. I mean, that would seem completely absurd. And yes, in the aftermath of this battle, it's especially bloody, even by the bloody standards of the Wars of the Roses. It's absolute butcher's work, really. The Lancastrian command is wiped out pretty much. Jasper Tudor manages to escape because he wasn't present at the battle. He didn't manage to join Margaret in time. And then another survivor is our man John de Vere, who luckily for him was running about up in Scotland on the Scottish border, being chased by Yorkists while Edward IV was slaughtering his allies. So this left John de Vere, the fugitive Earl of Oxford, with not many options, because all of his allies, or most of them, were now dead, certainly all the principal ones. Margaret herself was not killed, but she gave herself up soon afterwards, and politically was that was the end of her political career, really, with the death of her son. Her husband, Henry VI, who had been kept alive up until this point, he was murdered, frankly, very soon afterwards, a couple of days after the battle. 98% certainly on Edward IV's direct orders, although the Yorkists claim that he died of depression. We shouldn't be so naive. Henry had long outlived his usefulness. As I said, Edward was simply determined to wipe out all opposition from the Lancastrians, and for that to happen, the immediate royal family had to die, and so they did. So there we have it, the Battle of Tewkesbury and its aftermath. As before, if I've got anything wrong there, please feel free to correct me politely. But that's it in a nutshell. And we leave off with our man, the Earl of Oxford, in a very tight spot. So stay tuned. Thank you.